On the morning of the 9th of February, 1855, the villages along Devon's estuary woke to prints laid down overnight in fresh snow. Hoof-shaped, about 4 inches long, set one directly in front of the other, as though whatever made them walked upright. They were on the tops of houses. They went into the mouth of a drain and came out the other side, still walking. The Times printed it, clergymen preached about it, and the most famous fact in this case, that the line ran unbroken for 100 miles in one night, appears in no report written on the day. It arrives on the 24th of February in one letter from a teenage boy.
The winter of 1855. Welcome to the strange Casebook. Was the coldest anyone in Devon could remember. The thermometer barely climbed above freezing for 2 months, and stretches of the Exe and the Tane froze hard enough to hold games on the ice. Then, on the night of the 8th of February, heavy snow came down around midnight. Before dawn, it rained on a boisterous wind out of the east. And then it froze again. Snow, fall, frost. Remember that sequence. It does most of the work here.
At first light, the marks were everywhere. Exmouth, Littleham, Limstone, Topsham, Starcross, Dawlish, Teignmouth, more than 30 places, and a couple over the border in Dorset. The Times described tracks more like a biped than a quadruped. The steps generally 8 inches apart, each impression closely resembling a donkey's shoe. And it said where they were. In all kinds of inaccessible places, on the tops of houses and narrow walls, in gardens and courtyards.
What followed was not curiosity. The Times reported great excitement among all classes, and many superstitious people actually afraid to go outside their doors after night. In Dawlish, tradesmen went after the tracks with guns and bludgeons, and a hunting party put hounds into a wood. The hounds came back baying and terrified. Inside a day, the coast had decided the devil had walked through it.
The first public explanation came from a pulpit. On the 11th of February, the Reverend G.M. Musgrave preached at Limpstone Church and told the congregation the prints belonged to kangaroos escaped from a private menagerie at Sidmouth. It worked. It was also, by his own admission, worthless. A report was circulated. That was all he could ever say for it. He put the story about to break the fear in his parish, and he certainly did not pin his faith to it. On the 16th of February, the Times carried the story nationally, and here is the line almost every retelling has dropped. The impressions, it said, measured from 1.5 inches to, in some instances, 2.5 inches across. That is a range, a full inch of variation. The prints were not all the same.
8 days later, the Illustrated London News published a letter signed only South Devon, and it is the reason you have heard of this case at all. It gave the marks one fixed size, the perfect impression of a donkey's hoof, 4 inches by 2 3/4 inches, It said foot followed foot in a single line. It said the footmarks in every parish were exactly the same size. It said the track passed over the roofs of houses and hayricks and very high walls, one of them 14 feet, without displacing the snow. And it gave the figure that outlived everything else. The actual progress, it said, must have exceeded 100 miles.
The man who wrote it had not walked that 100 miles. He was William Durbin of Countess Ware outside Exeter, a teenager, not yet 19, raised partly in Canada and confident about reading tracks in snow. He would grow into a serious man, the first curator of Exeter's museum. But in February 1855, he gathered other people's reports, laid them end to end, and published the total as one journey.
So put the letter against the rest of the file. Identical prints in every parish? The Times had already said they varied by an inch, and the surviving parish tracings showed different shapes in different villages, some cloven, some continuous and concave, like a shoe. One unbroken line across the county? What the accounts actually describe is the individual prints falling in a straight line, one directly in front of the other. Not the route, the foot. One night, the marks at Topsham are dated the 13th of February, 5 days after the snow everybody remembers.
Take the letter out, and the 100-mile line goes with it. What is left is 30-odd parishes, one morning, and the same strange mark in all of them.
The best answer anyone gave came on the first morning, from a man whose name we do not have. At Aller Farm near Dawlish, the tenant went out on the 9th and recognized the marks. They were his cat's. The rain before dawn had half melted the paw prints, and the frost had set them again, closing the toes into the shape of a small hoof, with still the impression of a cat's claws enclosed. He told the vicar of Dawlish, Edward Furston. It went into a parish letter, and there it stayed.
London, meanwhile, was arguing about animals. Richard Owen, the anatomist who coined the word dinosaur, wrote that the culprit was badgers, the only plantigrade quadruped we have in this island. On the 8th of March, the Exeter Flying Post reported a man near Torquay following a trail through his garden to a large toad. 2 days later, a brewer named Thomas Fox sent the Illustrated London News drawings of rodent tracks, showing how the feet of a jumping rat close up into something very like a small hoof. That was the answer the next century would arrive at, in print within a month of the snow. It went nowhere for 100 years. Now set the animals against the constraints. Wood mice genuinely do leave a cloven-looking mark, and in the 1950s, the naturalist Alfred Leucher watched them hopping in Epping Forest and found the same shape, sharpened by exactly the thaw Devon had had. Donkeys genuinely do plant their feet in almost a single line. Badgers genuinely do range in hard winters. Each accounts for part of the record. None accounts for a 14-foot wall, and the 14-foot wall is in the letter. So is the 100 miles. So is the claim that every parish had prints of the same size. But two of the famous impossibilities are not his. Not the roofs. The Times had those 8 days before he wrote a word.
not the drain. That comes from a doctor at Topsham who reported a trail going into a pipe 6 inches across and out the other side. 6. The 4-inch pipe you have read about everywhere is a liter shrinkage.
That is the shape of this case. Every explanation fits the evidence you can check and fails the evidence you cannot. Take the balloon. An experimental balloon, the story goes, broke its mooring at Devonport dockyard and dragged its shackles across the county, stamping as it went. It reached print a century later, second-hand, from a man whose grandfather had worked at the dockyard. And no record of any such escape has ever been produced.
Then, the file went quiet for 95 years. In 1950, the Devonshire Association printed an appeal for information, and it shook loose the only real archive we have, the papers of the Reverend Henry Ellicombe, vicar of Clyst St. George, who spent that February collecting accounts from the clergy around him. Letters, sketches, tracings of the prints, and a draft letter to the Illustrated London News, marked in the file, not for publication. Somebody wrote to London and then held it back. We still do not know what it said.
In 1994, the historian Mike Dash gathered every surviving scrap into a paper for Fortean Studies. It is still the definitive account. His conclusion is neither a monster nor a debunking. There was no single source, he found. Some marks were probably hoaxes. Some were common quadrupeds, donkeys and ponies. Some were wood mice. And then the sentence people quoting him leave off. These cannot explain all of the reported marks. The mystery remains. One more, because it is as close as we get to standing in that snow. In March 2009, in a garden at Wolseley in North Devon, Jill Wade woke to a line of hoof-shaped prints about 5 inches long, running 70 feet in single file. A biologist from the Center for Fortean Zoology examined them fresh. Rabbit, he said, or hare. And they matched the historical descriptions. Here is what it will not carry. That anything walked 100 miles across Devon in a straight line. Nothing did. That line was assembled out of other people's parishes by a teenager with a pen. What is left is not a creature. It is a residue. A 14-foot wall, which exists because one boy wrote it down. Roofs, which the Times had first. A 6-inch drain at Topsham, which a doctor said he examined. None of it can be checked now. None of it has gone away. So which is the bigger mystery? What crossed Devon that night? Or how fast a county's worth of ordinary marks became one impossible animal, and stayed one for 170 years? The file stays open. I will see you at the next. If you'd like to sit with more cases like this, subscribe. The file stays open.